In general, scholars very loosely divide rhetoric into two specific components: rhetorical appeals and rhetorical devices. Rhetorical devices are the structures that one uses to achieve the rhetorical appeals, the end result of persuasion. Those would include things like repetition, assonance or alliteration, or other rhetorical devices, standard uses and forms of words that make the words one is speaking more effective overall. On the other side, the principles of rhetoric that have existed for literally generations largely come from Aristotle, who established them in his Rhetorica thousands of years ago. Aristotle said that all rhetoric should appeal to three things: ethos, logos, and pathos. I'm going to talk about each of these very briefly in turn. All three of these rhetorical appeals rely in some capacity upon a speaker or writer's ability to anticipate an audience. So appeals that work for you may not work for my parents, and so forth. Part of the job of someone who is creating any kind of rhetorical work, whether it's written or spoken or even graphic, is to anticipate a particular audience and to target the rhetoric that he or she comes up with towards the members of that particular audience. Ethos, which is where we get our modern word ethics, isn't just an ethical appeal. In fact, more formally, it's an appeal to authority. And perhaps one of the reasons that's very important is because ethics can be different from person to person. An ethical appeal might assume the presence of a shared God, so it could reference something like the Bible or the Quran, a religious text that has a significant amount of power over a certain group of people. However, an atheist is unlikely to be persuaded by the use of a verse from any of these texts, or by a reference to a rule that God has ordained. In this and other cases, it might be more effective to rely on, for example, an important leader, maybe a monarch, maybe a governor, possibly even a member of Congress. And it could also be, in certain circumstances, more prudent to rely on someone who has experience or credentials in a particular field. As someone with a doctorate who has been teaching for a number of years, I'm probably a reliable source for the correct way to write a thesis statement, but I would be a terrible source for plumbing information because I know very little about that. Similarly, the Bible or the Quran is probably a poor choice for a place to seek out plumbing information. The easiest way to describe an ethical appeal is to think about what kind of sources a writer or speaker uses to lend credibility to their statements. I can use any of these sources in an argument to advance my own position. The Bible says, the Quran says, the president says, the governor of Louisiana says, or even my plumber says, or my teacher says. Depending on your audience and also the topic, any one of those could be a useful and reliable ethical source for any piece of writing. When you're analyzing a text, you want to think about who the authority was for the writer that you're analyzing. Does the writer reference God? Does the writer reference some kind of ruler? Or does the writer reference additional sources that lend credibility to the writer by their established credentials or experiences? The second essential type of rhetorical appeal is logos, which is the Greek source from which we get our modern word logic. A logical appeal can certainly use actual logic. For instance, I might say, all statements use rhetoric. This is a statement, therefore this uses rhetoric. And in this case, that would be a formal logical proof. However, a logical appeal doesn't have to be based solely on formal logic. It can also use statistics, numbers, figures, and other evidence that support its argument. In fact, in addition to evidence, a logical appeal may rely heavily on an explanation or interpretation of that particular evidence. Evidence itself can be a form of logos, but evidence itself is not exclusively logos. The third form of rhetorical appeal that Aristotle described is called pathos, and it's the word from which we get our modern-day word pathetic. However, while pathetic has come to have a slightly negative connotation in modern American English, a pathetic appeal is not specifically what we would describe as disparagingly pathetic. Instead, it's anything that appeals to the emotions of the reader or listener. So in this context, many weddings might be pathetic because they should arouse the emotions of the viewers and the participants. A pathetic appeal doesn't have to be exclusive. It can also involve facts or logos, and it may even include a reference to an authority figure. In fact, all three of these rhetorical appeals, ethos, logos, and pathos, can be used either independently or in combination with one another. Aristotle generally suggested alternating between the three, but there are statements, such as 100 people starved in Africa today, that, if true, would contain both a piece of logos, a fact or a statistic, and also some pathos, evidence intended to appeal to your emotions. Rhetoric is at its most effective when it uses all three of these, but it also often uses rhetorical devices to accomplish this. The use of rhetorical devices to present all three rhetorical appeals usually culminates in the most effective rhetoric. However, it's important to be aware of one's audience because rhetorical appeals of any kind are unlikely to work on an audience who shares none of a speaker or writer's particular views or values. If you're trying to use these in your writing, it's important to think carefully about the shared values that you and your audience hold. If you're analyzing someone else's writing, it's important to identify that particular author's values to discover what that author considered appealing to authority, to logic, or to emotion.